After a week of jury selection, opening statements are set to begin today in the hush money trial against Donald Trump. And they're expected to reveal the clearest view yet of the allegations against the former president and Trump's expected defense. Trump pleaded not guilty to falsifying business records to conceal a hush money payment to Stormy Daniels before the 2016 election. We have team coverage starting with senior investigative correspondent Aaron Katursky outside the courthouse in downtown Manhattan.
Opening statements in the historic criminal trial of former President Trump.
And it's a shame. It's a shame. And I'm sitting here for days now, from morning till night.
Seated in court, Trump is relegated to silence. Prosecutors will introduce the case, which they've said is about whether the defendant, Donald Trump, broke the law in falsifying business records to cover up an agreement with others to unlawfully influence the 2016 presidential election. In their opening statement, defense attorneys are expected to say Trump relied on lawyers to arrange the $130,000 payment to Stormy Daniels to keep her from revealing her claim of a sexual encounter with Trump, which he has long denied.
I was paying a lawyer and marked it down as a legal expense. Some accountant, I didn't know, marked it down as a legal expense. That's exactly what it was.
Prosecutors say Trump worried about his electoral prospects and turned to National Enquirer publisher David Pecker, who they say was part of an alleged scheme to buy and bury unflattering stories about Trump. Pecker's among the early witnesses. Stormy Daniels will testify, along with Michael Cohen, Trump's former fixer, who wired her the hush money. Prosecutors said some of the witnesses have what you might consider some baggage. Trump says he could testify, too, during a trial expected to last 6 weeks.
I'm testifying. I tell the truth. I mean, all I can do is tell the truth.
The testimony is going to be heard by a jury of 7 men and 5 women. That includes 2 native New Yorkers and 2 immigrants. 7 jurors have advanced degrees. 1 juror praised Trump's outspokenness. Another called the former president selfish. Each promised to be fair and impartial.
And ABC News executive editorial producer John Santucci and ABC News contributor Kim Whaley joins me now for more. John, what are you watching for as these opening statements get started?
You know, it's funny. I'm going to be watching for a couple of things. First, I think that to see an image, and it's such a shame there's no cameras in New York State Court, but to see Donald Trump sitting there as prosecutors describe him as a criminal, right? To think Donald Trump cannot say anything, cannot do anything. You know, there was a great piece in the New York Times over the weekend, Diane, and it said it was one of the rare moments that Donald Trump was ordered to sit down in his life in court on Friday as they were wrapping proceedings. That is going to be Donald Trump's life for the next several weeks. His schedule, his agenda, his ability to speak, it is all out of his hands for the first time ever. So I think just that body language to see Donald Trump sitting there is going to be striking. The other thing that I think we're going to see from the defense side of the Trump arguments here is really a breakdown of the witnesses, because this is a case that really became to life after Michael Cohen first spoke to special counsel Robert Mueller and detailed some of Donald Trump's financial practices. So Cohen is a main target for Team Trump to tear him down. So I think seeing how much they get into that in opening statements, right, to, of course, defend President Trump, as it's their job to do, but start attacking the other witnesses that are going to be called. And it's just a reminder, right? They're attacking people, or probably will attack people, that Donald Trump himself hired. And I think that's going to be a really hard argument to make for a guy that has said repeatedly, I only hire the best people.
Oh, and John, you talk about body language. Trump has chosen, today he has to be in court, but he has chosen on many other occasions to be in court by choice. So what are you hearing from his inner circle? Is there a part of him that likes the fact that he gets to be there, that he gets to look these jurors in the eyes, that he gets to look these witnesses in the eyes?
Complete opposite. He hates every single moment of this because, again, it is not within his control. The other thing you have to remember, too, is that this case is going to get into a lot of Donald Trump's personal and private life. You know, one of the things that is going to come up at some point during this trial, because one of the witnesses is Stormy Daniels. They're going to talk about, in some way, shape, or form, Donald Trump's, I hate to say it, but sex life. And that's something that Donald Trump is, as I've been told by sources, embarrassed about. He doesn't want to talk about it. I mean, would anybody want to talk about that in open public? And that's just a reminder, right, that so much of this is going to get personal. You know, think about the other witnesses that have been mentioned in court by Judge Merchan and included as part of our reporting as a potential list by prosecutors. They're going to bring in many former assistants to Donald Trump. Donald Trump didn't have have many assistants during his professional life. He only had 2, believe it or not. One was with him up until she died, the other up until he went to the White House. They knew everything about Donald Trump, and in part because Donald Trump, in the era with which he rose to fame and success, didn't use technology, didn't use computers. It was known that if you had to email or reach out to Donald Trump once we got into the 21st century, you went to Rona Graff, his longtime assistant. She is the gatekeeper. She knows everything about Donald Trump's life. So depending how wide of a scope prosecutors do, could be a lot of things revealed about Donald Trump that, frankly, none of us knew before.
Now, Kim, it took a week to select this jury. 7 men, 5 women. What stands out to you about those picked?
I think it's interesting. There are 3, I think, attorneys on the jury. That is unusual. When I was a first-year law student, my law professor told the class, look around, none of you will ever be on a jury. So someone will be the foreperson, and that person, I think, will help potentially the other jurors understand the legal concept, this idea that it's not just the falsifying records, it's not the hush money, it's the connection between stopping this bad information from getting out in the 2016 election and then allegedly falsifying the business records. It's a novel theory. This is unusual to have the falsification of business records, the standalone alleged crime here. Usually it's an add-on to other serious crimes. So I think the jurors are probably going to look to some of these lawyers. The other piece, of course, has to come down to credibility. As John said, it will be, in a way, the dueling credibility of Donald Trump, who's claiming publicly anyway that he had no knowledge of this, that he was just passing it along to his lawyers, and then people like David Pecker and Michael Cohen, who might testify, listen, I had a conversation, or he knew exactly why this $130,000 was going to Stormy Daniels, and it did have to do with the election. It wasn't about embarrassing information getting to his wife Melania, for example.
And we're watching the motorcade now. We just saw former President Trump leave Trump Tower, get into the SUV, and now we're watching the motorcade make its way down to court. John, what are you hearing from Trump's inner circle as they prepare for opening statements in this historic trial now? This is the first time we're going to see this happening in criminal court with a former president.
Well, I think that one of the things that they've been talking about, Diane, is that they want to be able to bring other people into court to be around Donald Trump. Now, that's going to be a little challenging because of just the setup of the courthouse. But one of the things that they are preparing for in part is twofold, right? Number one, it's the audience of one, in the sense that, though Donald Trump's lawyers have a job to do, if they don't hit certain points, if they don't, get certain, items across the board that Donald Trump wants to make sure are said or heard, that's going to be a struggle for them, because we know, and we saw it in court during jury selection, Donald Trump will not hold back. When he has an opinion, he'll pull his lawyers down, he'll write them notes. I mean, he's a very active client. He doesn't sit there passively at all. I don't think there's anybody who would ever say Donald Trump is passive in any aspect of his life. The other thing that, you have to just brace for here in part as this gets underway, and we saw some of the reporting from the jury selection that Donald Trump was, closing his eyes, moving around. There's going to be parts of this, forgive me, that are going to be a little boring when you go through witnesses and whatnot. Not every witness is going to be explosive. Some of it is going to be very paper, if you will, because it's a financial case at the end of the day. So we'll hear from
comptrollers. Who signed what document, what date, what does that line mean?
Exactly. So, I mean, some of that's just going to, frankly, put anybody to sleep. So I think Donald Trump actually keeping his attention when he can't be on his cell phone, can't be talking to anybody, can't, again, we said earlier, get up and move around. I think just that's going to be interesting to see how you control Donald Trump as a client. And again, don't take my word for it, right? We've now seen Donald Trump in a courtroom. Think about at E. Jean Carroll, the case that happened earlier this year. He got so annoyed at one point during Roberta Kaplan's closing statements. Remember, he got up and bolted, right? That's that iconic image that the sketch artist drew of him just saying, I'm out of here. Can't do that in criminal court. And again, I do think you made a great point earlier where Donald Trump, said he, went to court because he had to go and he liked being there. That was civil when he could pick. This is criminal. He cannot. Different world.
And again, for anyone just joining us, we're watching the motorcade there with former President Trump headed to court in downtown Manhattan for the hush money trial against him. This will be the first time prosecutors will be presenting a criminal case against a former president before a newly seated jury. Kim, Trump's lawyers are expected to focus on the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses here, suggesting the case is politically motivated. How big of a hurdle is the political timing here for the prosecution? Former President Trump is running for president, currently the Republican presumptive nominee, and that election is just a few months away now.
Well, anytime there's a public figure that's in politics that is indicted and prosecuted, arguably it's political because they're a politician. So I think that the idea that somehow this is politically motivated was probably sorted out during jury selection. That's part of the point of the voir dire, is to make sure the jurors not so much know nothing about Donald Trump. That's probably not someone you'd want on a jury that is just asleep and has no idea what's going on, but someone who can say, listen, I can set those biases, potentially those viewpoints aside, and just decide the case based on the evidence. I think the defense is going to argue, like most defense attorneys, that the burden of proof is on the government. They have to put all the beans on the scale. In theory, Donald Trump doesn't have to prove or disprove anything. His lawyers could just sit there and say, listen, you've heard all the evidence. They just haven't demonstrated that Donald Trump had the intent to defraud. It's that state of mind. It's climbing in his brain and his thinking that really is the line between a civil type of case where you could have money damages or an injunction and a criminal case. The big line being a criminal case can deprive someone of their liberty, that can actually end up putting the person in prison. And that's why it's so important that the government be held to its burden of proof. The government's also, though, going to have to make sure, however it does things, it preserves the appeal, that it doesn't allow things to get in or mistakes to be made that Donald Trump later, if there is a verdict against him, can use to overturn it. So all of these moving parts have to be taken into account. And I do think that the prosecution is motivated to make sure this is not about politics. It's about the evidence. It's making sure the evidence is in there pursuant to the rules of evidence legally, and that they persuade the jury that the elements of this crime have been proven beyond a reasonable doubt.
All right, former President Trump now headed to that court as we speak. John Santucci, Kim Whaley, thank you both. And we will be following this trial all day long. We will bring you updates right here on ABC News Live as soon as we have them.